I never liked camping much, but my brother, David, was obsessed with it. He grew up watching survival shows and reading books about the wilderness. He loved the challenge of being out there with nothing but the gear on his back. I, on the other hand, preferred a good motel with running water and a bed. But when he invited me on a weekend trip to a remote area in Wyoming, I agreed. Maybe it was guilt from always saying no, or maybe I just wanted to prove I wasn't as soft as he thought. Either way, I regretted it before we even reached the trailhead. We parked the truck at a dirt clearing and loaded up our packs. The place was far from any marked camping spots, the kind of area only locals knew about. David had found it through a friend who swore it was the best hidden gem for true outdoorsmen. I remember checking my phone one last time before we headed in. Zero service. That was expected, but it still made my stomach twist. The first few hours were fine. The hike was tough, but the scenery was beautiful. Pine trees stretched high above us, their needles thick under our boots. A stream cut through the valley below, glinting in the afternoon sun. I had to admit it was peaceful. We reached the campsite in the early evening. It was a flat clearing near a small lake, completely untouched. No fire pits, no signs of other campers. Just raw, undisturbed land. David was in his element, setting up the tent and gathering firewood. I helped where I could, but mostly I just watched. As night fell, we got a fire going and cooked some canned chili. The stars came out, brighter than I'd ever seen. I almost started to enjoy myself. But then, just as we were settling in for the night, we heard it. A scream. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It echoed through the trees, high-pitched and sudden. My heart hammered. I looked at David, but he just shook his head. "Probably a fox," he muttered. "They sound weird at night." I wanted to believe him, but something about it felt off. It hadn't sounded like an animal. It had sounded like a person. A woman, maybe, but there was no way someone else was out here, not this deep in the woods. I didn't sleep well. Every rustle in the trees made me jolt awake. I told myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest. But at some point in the night, I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not the skittering of an animal, but the weight of something, someone moving just beyond our camp. I held my breath and listened. The steps circled us, crunching softly on the forest floor. I wanted to wake David, but I didn't move. I just lay there, frozen, until they finally stopped. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the sun rose, I climbed out of the tent, expecting to see nothing. But then I saw the footprints. They weren't ours. I called David over, my stomach twisting. The prints were deep, spaced far apart. Someone had been walking around our camp, watching us. David stared at them for a long moment before shaking his head. "Probably a hunter," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. I wanted to leave. I told David we should pack up, that this place felt wrong. He laughed it off, said I was being paranoid. I almost argued, but then I saw it. Something hanging from a tree at the edge of our camp. A rabbit, skinned, strung up by its legs, swinging slightly in the breeze. The blood was still fresh. David's face went pale. He had no answer for that. We packed up fast. No breakfast, no talking, just moving. My hands were shaking as I rolled up my sleeping bag. The whole time I felt watched. The hike back was brutal, and not just because of the terrain. Every few minutes, I checked over my shoulder, expecting to see someone in the trees. And then, about halfway back, we found the second one. Another rabbit. This one was right in the middle of the trail, fresh just like the first. But this time there was something else. A knife, stuck in the dirt next to the rabbit, blade deep in the ground. A hunting knife, well worn, with a wooden handle. David picked it up and turned it in his hands. His expression was unreadable, but his grip was tight. He didn't say anything. We just kept walking, faster now, almost running. By the time we reached the truck, my shirt was soaked with sweat. We tossed our packs in the back and climbed in. David locked the doors, started the engine, and peeled out of there so fast the tires kicked up dust. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, as the road smoothed out, David exhaled sharply. "We don't talk about this," he said. I nodded. We never did. But I know deep down that whoever was out there had been watching us the whole time, and they hadn't wanted us to leave. I never considered myself the type to get scared easily. I've camped in the wilderness more times than I can count, and I always felt comfortable being alone in the woods. But this trip was different. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, my gear, and the quiet of nature. Nothing unusual. But by the end of it, I swore I'd never camp alone again. It started on a Friday afternoon. I had picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from the usual campgrounds. I didn't want to deal with noisy neighbors or people blasting music. I wanted peace. I wanted the kind of quiet where you could hear the wind moving through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl at night, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I parked my truck on the side of an old dirt road and hiked about a mile in before setting up camp. It was a beautiful spot, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a stream nearby for water. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and made a small fire to cook dinner. As the sun started dipping below the treetops, I ate my meal, stretched out in my chair, and listened to the sounds of the forest coming to life. The first sign that something was off happened just as it got dark. I was finishing my food when I heard something moving through the trees behind me. Not just the occasional rustle of a small animal. This was heavier, steadier, like footsteps. I turned my head, scanning the trees, but I didn't see anything. Probably a deer, I thought. Still, something about it made me uneasy. I kept my flashlight close, but eventually, the noise stopped. I told myself I was being paranoid and went back to enjoying the fire. A few hours passed. The night deepened. The fire crackled softly, and the air was cool. I was just about ready to turn in when I heard it again. This time, it was closer. Slow, deliberate footsteps, just beyond the reach of my fire's light. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound, but all I saw were trees. I stood up, my heart starting to pound. Probably just an animal, I muttered to myself, though I didn't fully believe it. I clapped my hands loudly, hoping to startle whatever it was into running. Nothing. I picked up a rock and threw it into the darkness. I heard it land, but nothing moved. Now I was on edge. I wasn't about to go wandering into the woods chasing noises, but I also wasn't comfortable sitting by the fire like a sitting duck. I decided to turn in for the night, but I kept my knife close and my flashlight within arm's reach. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and listened. The forest was too quiet. Anyone who spent time camping knows that the woods are never silent. There's always something. A chirping insect, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustling of leaves. But now it was dead silent, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I lay there for what felt like hours, straining my ears. And then just outside my tent, I heard breathing. Slow, steady breathing. My entire body tensed. I gripped my knife, barely daring to breathe myself. This wasn't an animal. This was human. I stayed as still as possible, listening. The breathing didn't go away. It was close, right outside the thin fabric of my tent. I could hear the faint sound of movement, the soft crunch of leaves. Then the zipper of my tent moved. Panic shot through me like ice water. I exploded up, grabbing the handle, yanking it back down before whoever was out there could get it open. I shouted, "Who's there?" trying to sound as aggressive as possible. Silence. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I waited, gripping the zipper, my knuckles white. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard slow footsteps retreating. I stayed like that for a long time, barely breathing, listening as the footsteps faded into the woods. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, exhaustion took over. I didn't sleep much. Every little sound made my pulse race. At first light, I unzipped my tent cautiously, stepping outside with my knife in hand. Everything looked normal except for the footprints. They were human, barefoot, leading from the trees to my tent. My stomach turned. Someone had been watching me, standing outside my tent, breathing inches away from where I slept. I packed up my camp in record time, constantly looking over my shoulder. As I hiked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The whole way back, the forest felt different, wrong, like I was trespassing somewhere I shouldn't be. I reached my truck, threw my gear in, and got the hell out of there. I never went back. I don't know who was out there that night, but I know this. Some things are worse than ghosts. Some things are real, and they're out there in the woods waiting. That thought kept running through my mind as I lay in my tent, staring at the thin fabric ceiling, my body stiff as a board, ears straining for every little sound outside. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but I forced myself to take slow, steady breaths. Something wasn't right. I knew that now, and I also knew I was completely alone out here. The trip started off fine. I had been wanting to go on a solo camping trip for a while, just a weekend out in the woods to clear my mind. I'd camped plenty of times before, always with friends or family, but something about going alone appealed to me. No distractions, no conversations, just me and nature. I picked a spot deep in a national forest, far enough away from the designated campgrounds to feel truly isolated. I parked my truck at a trailhead, strapped my backpack on, and hiked about 6 miles into the wilderness. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and I had everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a knife, a small hatchet, and a few other essentials. I set up camp in a clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a small creek running nearby. It was peaceful. The first day passed without anything unusual. I collected firewood, made dinner, and sat by the fire as the sun dipped below the trees. The sounds of the forest were comforting: birds calling, leaves rustling in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl. I wasn't afraid. I enjoyed the solitude. I even fell asleep easily, listening to the crackling of the dying fire. But something changed the next day. I woke up feeling off, like something had shifted. The air was different, heavier somehow. I shrugged it off and went about my morning routine. Boiled water, made coffee, ate some granola. But as I sat by my fire pit, staring at the embers, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Footprints. Not mine. They were just outside my campsite, in the damp soil near the creek. Bare footprints, like someone had walked there barefoot. But the thing that made my blood run cold was the size. They were small. Too small for an adult, but not quite the size of a child's either. Something about them looked unnatural. The way the toes dug deep into the mud, as if whoever had made them had gripped the earth with their feet. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe someone else was out here. Maybe a lost hiker or even some kid messing around. But I hadn't seen a single person since I left my truck. And what kind of person walks around barefoot in the middle of the woods? I told myself it didn't matter. I packed up my food, made sure my fire was completely out, and decided to do some hiking. I wasn't going to let some weird footprints ruin my trip. The hike didn't help. That strange, heavy feeling didn't go away. The woods felt wrong. Too quiet. No birds. No wind. just the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the forest floor. I walked for miles, climbing up to a ridge where I could see the expanse of trees stretching out below me. It should have been beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got back to camp, the sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. I felt relieved to be back at my tent, but that relief disappeared the moment I saw my campsite. Something had gone through my things. My backpack was unzipped, my food bag rummaged through. My knife was missing. The small hatchet I had left next to the fire pit was gone too. My sleeping bag had been pulled halfway out of my tent, like someone had been looking inside. I stood there, heart pounding. Animals, I told myself, but I knew better. No animal would unzip a backpack. No animal would take a knife. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees darker, taller. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Whoever had been here could still be watching me. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But hiking 6 miles back to my truck in the dark wasn't an option. I still had a few hours of daylight left, so I forced myself to stay calm and do what I could. I secured my remaining supplies, gathered more firewood than I needed, and made sure my fire was big and bright. Fire felt safe. Fire kept things away. The night came slowly, the darkness creeping in as the fire crackled and popped. I sat with my back against a tree, watching the flames, listening to the night. Every little sound made my skin crawl. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance, a rustling noise in the underbrush. My imagination was running wild, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was out there. Then, just past the firelight, I saw it, a figure, low to the ground, crouched at the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out its face, couldn't see details, but it was there, watching. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My hands were gripping my thighs so hard my fingers ached. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air. And then, just like that, the figure was gone. I don't remember sleeping that night. I sat by the fire until it burned low, gripping a heavy branch like a weapon, eyes darting to every shadow. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my things in record time and started the long hike back. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. My whole body was tense, every nerve on edge, waiting for something, anything, to come after me. But nothing did. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and peeled out of there without a second glance. I don't know what I saw. I don't know who or what was out there with me, but I do know one thing. I will never go camping alone again. I don't even know why I'm writing this. Maybe if I put it down, it won't feel as real. Maybe if I put it into words, I can convince myself it was just my imagination. But I know it wasn't. It was last fall when I went camping alone. I'd done it plenty of times before. I like being out in the quiet, away from everything. No traffic, no voices, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the crackle of a fire. I always make sure to go prepared. Plenty of food, extra water, a good tent, a sharp knife. You never know what you might run into, and I don't mean just animals. I chose a spot deep in the woods, further than most people go. I don't like crowded campgrounds with screaming kids and people blasting music. I wanted to be alone. That's the whole reason I go. The place I picked was about 10 miles from the nearest road, up a winding trail through thick forest. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat clearing near a small stream. Looked perfect. I got there in the early afternoon, set up my tent, and started a fire before it got dark. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet, but I figured it was just the time of year. Most animals don't move much when it gets colder. I made dinner, sat by the fire, and watched the stars come out. It was peaceful. Then I heard it. At first, it was just a small sound, like something stepping on a dry leaf. I looked up, expecting to see a deer or maybe a raccoon nosing around. Nothing. I listened for a while, but it didn't happen again. The fire was burning low, so I threw another log on and sat back. Probably just the wind. A little later, I decided to turn in for the night. The air was crisp, and the warmth of my sleeping bag felt good. I fell asleep fast, but something woke me up. A noise. Something wasn't right. I lay still, listening. There it was again, something moving outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps. Not an animal. Animals move differently. They scurry, they pause, they change direction. This was steady, slow, careful. I reached for my knife. I didn't unzip the tent, not yet. I just listened. The footsteps stopped right outside. I held my breath. Then something brushed against the tent wall. I shot up, knife in hand, heart pounding. Silence. No breathing, no more movement. Just silence. I waited, staring at the fabric of the tent, expecting a shadow to move across it, expecting to hear something. But there was nothing. Minutes passed. Then, just as I started to think maybe I'd imagined it, I heard a sound that made my stomach drop. The zipper of my tent. It wasn't loud, just the faintest tug, like someone testing it. I didn't think. I lunged forward and slammed my hand against the zipper from the inside, gripping the knife so tight my knuckles ached. The sound stopped. I held my breath again, listening, my heart beating so hard I felt it in my throat. Nothing. Then footsteps, slow and steady, moving away. I waited. I don't know how long. Eventually, I forced myself to peek outside. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers. The trees stood still in the pale moonlight. I couldn't see anything. No footprints, no signs of anyone. But I knew what I heard. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up, knife in hand, staring at the tent flap, listening. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was nothing, that maybe a branch fell and caught on the zipper or something. But deep down, I knew better. As soon as the sun came up, I packed up and left. I didn't eat, didn't take my time. I just packed and walked. Fast. When I got back to my truck, I felt relief wash over me. I threw my gear in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking. I started the engine, ready to get the hell out of there. Then I noticed something. In the dirt, just outside my driver's side door, was a footprint. A bare footprint. Not an animal's. Not a boot. A human foot. It was fresh. The edges still crisp. And next to it, another. And another. Leading from the trees. I didn't look around. I didn't stop to think. I just drove. I haven't been camping since. I never liked camping, but my friend convinced me to go. He had just bought a new tent and some fancy gear, and he wouldn't shut up about wanting to test it all out. I told him I'd go if he picked a spot that wasn't too deep in the woods. I didn't mind nature, but I wasn't one of those people who thought it was fun to sleep on the ground and wake up with bugs crawling in my sleeping bag. He agreed and picked a campground a couple of hours away from the city. It had marked trails, a lake for fishing, and was far enough from civilization to feel like we were roughing it without actually being too far from help. We got there in the afternoon. The place was mostly empty, which wasn't surprising since it was off-season. We set up camp near the tree line, not too far from the main road, but still secluded enough to feel like we were alone in the woods. It was nice, actually. The air smelled like pine, the wind rustled the leaves, and for a while, I almost understood why people liked camping. My friend was in a good mood, cracking jokes while we built a fire. The sun started to set, and the sky turned that deep shade of orange and purple that made everything feel calm. It was peaceful. That peace didn't last long. The first weird thing happened when I went to grab some firewood. I had wandered maybe 50 feet from the campsite when I found something strange. a pile of rocks stacked neatly into a small tower. At first, I didn't think much of it. People did weird things when they camped. Maybe someone had left it there before us. But then I noticed more of them, scattered around the area, each one carefully built. Some were small, others were almost knee-high. They weren't randomly placed either. They looked intentional, like someone had gone through a lot of effort to arrange them just right. I called out to my friend, asking if he had seen them. He just shrugged and said they were probably left by some hikers. I wanted to believe him, but something about them felt off. It wasn't just that they were there. It was the way they looked, the way they seemed almost too perfect. I shook off the feeling and went back to camp, trying to push it out of my mind. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The tent was warm, the sleeping bag was comfortable, but something didn't feel right. It was too quiet. I know that sounds weird. People always say nature is peaceful, but this was different. There were no crickets, no rustling in the bushes, nothing. Just dead silence. Put me on edge, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I turned over, squeezed my eyes shut, and forced myself to sleep. I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard it again. A soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps moving through the leaves. My heart started pounding. I held my breath, listening. The sound was coming from just outside the tent. I slowly reached for my flashlight, my fingers shaking as I switched it on. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the tent walls, but I didn't see anything. I waited, listening, but the footsteps had stopped. After what felt like forever, I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon looking for food. I turned off the flashlight and tried to go back to sleep, but my body wouldn't relax. I lay there, staring at the tent ceiling, counting the seconds until morning. The next day, we found something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints outside the tent. Human footprints. They weren't ours. They were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt, circling the tent. I felt sick. Someone had been out there walking around while we slept. My friend tried to brush it off, saying it was probably just another camper. But we hadn't seen anyone else since we arrived. And what kind of person walks around someone else's tent in the middle of the night without saying anything? We should have packed up and left. But we didn't. We convinced ourselves it was nothing, that we were just being paranoid. We spent the rest of the day hiking, trying to enjoy the trip, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. That night, it happened again. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. This time, it was closer. I could hear breathing. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on. But before I could unzip the tent, something pressed against the fabric. It was a handprint, pushing against the material from the outside, just inches from my face. I stopped breathing. I couldn't move. The hand stayed there for what felt like an eternity, then slowly slid away. I heard footsteps, then silence. I wanted to scream for my friend, but I was too scared to make a sound. I sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for whatever was out there to come back. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The first light, we packed up and left. We didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't stop to eat breakfast, didn't take any last pictures of the campsite. We just threw everything into the car and drove. My friend tried to act normal, but I could tell he was just as shaken as I was. When we got home, I checked the news, looking for any reports of strange activity in the area. I didn't find anything. No missing people, no strange sightings. Nothing. But I know what I saw. Someone was out there watching us, waiting, and I don't think they wanted us to leave. I always loved camping. The quiet of the woods, the smell of pine, the distant calls of birds as the sun dips behind the trees. It was my way to escape from everything. The noise of the city, the stress of work, the constant pull of technology. Just me, the wilderness, and the raw beauty of nature. This time, I picked a secluded spot in the mountains, miles away from any town. The area wasn't a popular one, which is exactly why I chose it. I didn't want other campers nearby, no drunk guys blasting music, no kids screaming, just peace. I parked my truck near a small clearing, packed my gear, and hiked about 3 miles into the forest, following an old, overgrown trail that I had found on an old topographical map. By the time I found a good spot, it was already late afternoon. The trees were thick, and the canopy overhead let in just enough sunlight to create a golden glow through the leaves. I set up my tent, built a fire ring with stones, and gathered enough wood to last the night. It felt good to be out here, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. As night fell, I cooked some food over the fire and sat back, enjoying the sounds of the forest. The crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the crackling of burning wood. Everything felt normal, peaceful. But then, sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had startled me. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow over my campsite. The forest was silent, too silent. No crickets, no wind, just stillness. Then I heard it, a soft crunch, footsteps on dried leaves. I froze, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. My mind went through the possibilities. A deer? A bear? A mountain lion? I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, careful not to make too much noise. The footsteps had stopped. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing. I shined my flashlight outside, sweeping it over the trees. The beam caught nothing but thick trunks and shadows. I told myself it was an animal passing through, but still, I didn't like it. Something about the way the night felt, the way the silence pressed against me. It put me on edge. I kept my knife close and sat up for a while, just listening. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell back asleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Near the edge of my camp, where the trees thickened, I saw footprints. Not animal tracks, human, barefoot. They were deep, the toes clearly visible in the dirt. Whoever it was had been standing there for a while, watching. I looked around, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. I told myself it had to be an old footprint, maybe from a hiker long ago. But I knew that wasn't true. The prints were fresh, made sometime after I had set up camp the night before. Someone had been out here, watching me. I packed up my things faster than I ever had before. I wasn't about to stick around and find out who or what had been there. As I made my way back to my truck, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing just beyond the trees, watching. But I never saw anyone. By the time I reached my truck, I was drenched in sweat, heart racing. I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and drove without looking back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in civilization, surrounded by people, streetlights, noise. I never went back to that place. I never even checked a map to see exactly where I had been. Some things are better left unknown. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. Just me, the woods, and a few days of peace away from everything. I needed a break from work, from people, from all the noise of everyday life. I picked a secluded camping spot deep in the national forest, far from the usual crowded sites. I wanted quiet, isolation, just nature and me. I drove for hours, the roads getting narrower, more winding, until they were just dirt paths cutting through thick forest. Eventually, I reached the spot I had found on a map, an old, unmaintained campsite, long forgotten by most. The fire ring was still there, buried under leaves and dirt, but otherwise, nature had started reclaiming the space. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in. The air was crisp, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves filling the silence. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. That first night, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, just enjoying the stillness. The wind picked up a bit, making the trees sway, creaking like old doors in a forgotten house. I listened to the sounds of the forest, branches snapping somewhere in the distance, small animals scurrying through the underbrush, normal woods sounds. But then I noticed something. Pattern. The snapping branches weren't random. They were rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps. Someone or something was walking out there, past the tree line, just beyond where my firelight reached. I held still, barely breathing, straining to hear. The footsteps would stop, then start again, moving parallel to my campsite. Too slow to be an animal, too quiet to be a person stumbling through the dark. And yet it was there. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. I went to bed, zipped up in my sleeping bag, the fire reduced to embers. But I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening, waiting. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear it again. Twigs breaking, the soft crunch of leaves. Something was out there, watching. Morning finally came, and I stepped outside, rubbing the stiffness from my muscles. The air was cool, the sunlight filtering through the trees. I looked around, expecting to see nothing, but then I saw them. Footprints, human footprints, bare feet, slightly uneven, leading from the edge of the trees toward my tent. They stopped just a few feet away from where I had been sleeping. I felt my stomach drop. I was miles from the nearest road, deep in the wilderness. No one should have been out here, no one but me. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe a hiker had wandered through during the night, lost, confused, but that didn't make sense. No one hikes barefoot through the woods in the middle of the night. And if they were lost, why hadn't they called out for help? I decided to leave early. I packed up my gear, trying not to rush, trying to act normal, like I wasn't freaked out. But every so often, I would glance at the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. The drive back felt longer. The trees seemed to close in around me, the road rougher than before. My heart didn't stop pounding until I reached the highway, until I was back in civilization, surrounded by cars, buildings, people. I told myself it was nothing, just a strange experience, an odd coincidence. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that someone had been out there with me that night. Someone who had been watching. Someone who had stood just outside my tent, listening to me breathe in my sleep. I don't go camping alone anymore.